Oops. Good afternoon, everybody. Glad that you all signed up. I'm sharing with you this afternoon a kind of proven model that I've used to bring in a past life a dual language to the first Illinois school district outside of Chicago. I used this model to create newcomer programs that were separate site programs, as well as an overlay of services onto existing programs. I've used this model to modernize ESL and bilingual programs, and I've used this model to create and implement world language or foreign language at the elementary level. You can see on the screen my background and some of the things I've done recently. So today we only have an hour to share this information, and it's quite a bit of information in a short period of time. But I did, in addition to, describing the process, I will delve into the mindset that goes with the process and then give you an opportunity to do some reflection and some application, as well as some action planning. And so those materials were sent to you earlier this morning. There's you have access to the slide deck, as well as to the logic model and to the action planning. And that'll come later in our time together. So this is the process that I've used, like I said, across multiple types of programs that benefit multilingual learners, whether those are bilingual programs, dual language programs, ESL programs, newcomer programs, or world language, foreign language at the elementary level. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this process, explaining the different components to you. It's an adaptation of, some of you may be familiar with the ADDIE model for program design. This is a little bit different than that because it takes into account the need for local perspective. Among our multilingual learners, we have such great diversity within that group of children and parents and families and communities. And this process allows you to really pull in that perspective of student, family, parents, and community. It also, in the convening part, we also want to be sure that the teacher perspective is considered when contemplating any program design model for multilingual learners. And teacher perspective will, of course, include the teachers of multilingual students, whether they be ESL teachers, they be bilingual teachers, dual teachers, foreign language teachers, but also gen ed teachers. For example, specials teachers who always receive English learners, no matter their language proficiency level. We also want to consider the principal perspective. How does a particular program work in a building? Or what does the principal see as needs to be met within their building? Anybody who's gone through a compliance review knows that principals are accountable for the programs that reside in their building. So yes, it's the bilingual ESL director's responsibility, but it is also the principal's responsibility, especially when it comes to compliance review, but also with interaction with parents. Principals really want to know, understand, and be able to enthusiastically support the programs that are in their building. So when you're creating a new program model, you want to be sure that you include principal voice. Doesn't have to be all the principals, but as long as principal voice is represented, that's good. I would encourage also student perspective. So in K-8 school districts, you can certainly from 5th grade up find ways to involve students in this process. They may not always attend meetings, but you can solicit their feedback through interviews, through surveys, to hear and understand what they think is really important to include in the program design. Once you get up into high school, certainly those students can perhaps even actively participate in some of the convening meetings and lend a perspective that sometimes it's easy for the rest of us to forget, and to really hear what their concerns are and what their issues are. Also, family perspective. We want to hear from the parents of our multilingual students. Even if their English isn't so fluent, there are ways that we can draw them in and make sure that they have a voice and that their voice is heard in this process of creation or modernization. And then last but not least, we want to make sure we include the district perspective. That could be the assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction, could be the director of special ed. On one of my committees, I brought in the chief financial officer, and that was really helpful because he previously didn't understand maybe some of the things that we were doing in the multilingual program. And then when he was a part of the committee, it started to all click and make sense for him. And so he became very much an advocate for what we were doing with our bilingual program. So convening that group is the first step, and that assures that there is broad representation, that folks have a voice, and it helps to build shared responsibility so that people start to see multilingual learners as not just my kids or your kids, but our kids. And it also kind of paves the way for greater buy-in and greater acceptance of whatever change is coming down the road. It also assures that not only do we have all our oars in the water, but we're actually rowing in the same direction. So we're more likely to have better student outcomes and therefore better programmatic outcomes. So then we move into the discover phase. And this is through convened groups where we learn first and foremost about the legal parameters. This would be both state and federal legal parameters, federal legislation, judicial precedent or case law, as well as our state Illinois school code. As an administrator myself, I know that both in my master's program and in my doctorate program, really the legal parameters around multilingual learners were kind of glossed over. We had very rigorous attention paid to special education and general education, but the legal parameters are sometimes left to the side. And it's really important that everybody on the team know and understand what the minimum requirements are for the education of our multilingual learners, and so as to prevent any kind of legal jeopardy or any kind of ignorance about what is compliant and what is not. In addition, we want to make sure that we're looking at the research. We want to be sure that we're looking at research that is longitudinal, that spans multiple years and large sample sizes. The research that relies on maybe 30 individuals over a 6-week period is not the kind of research that really should be driving program design. It can drive instruction and instructional strategies, but for program design, you're looking at research that spans sometimes 10, 12 years and has thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, even millions of students involved. And that will help you arrive at some good decisions about what's going to work well in your local community. Best practice evidence. This is where I like to pull in things that have been working for the district, and they can document that. It may not be research supported, but we have years of, let's say, evidence that the things that were happening at school A have really produced outstanding results. And so we want to capture that and, keep that if that's been working in the community. We want to include then our local data as well. And we want to think about quantitative for sure, but also qualitative and perceptual. So the quantitative, right, we all know we've got IAR scores, but how are we looking at IAR scores in Illinois? Are we disaggregating for language proficiency? Are we dividing our data so that we can look at our current ELs, our former ELs, and our never ELs? And are we spending time to analyze that data, whether it's IAR data, whether it's MAP data, or if we're using some other measures, and then how are we folding access into that? Because the access test is the one test, especially for our more limited English proficient kids, that is designed for them, and it has the highest validity and reliability. So we want to be sure that we're taking a look at that. And we're also looking at special education, and we're looking to see how many of our current, former, and never ELs have an IEP. What is the percentage of ELs with an IEP? And then also looking to MTSS. How are our interventions working for our multilingual learners? What does tier 2 look like? What does tier 3 look like? How are we calibrating our interventions to their language proficiency level? And what's our success rate in terms of MTSS with our multilingual learners? Perceptual data is also really important. Someone famous said, perception is reality. And the way people perceive your program is often how your program is known. It doesn't mean that those perceptions are accurate, but perception goes a long way. So I will introduce Tony Wagner's 4 C's framework as a way to map out the as is, or the status quo. And that relies heavily on perceptual data, but gives you a way to capture that and then bring that back to the team so that the team can look at that and make some critical decisions. So then once we've exhausted the discovery phase and the team is feeling much more knowledgeable, with greater understanding of all the issues that are involved in the education of multilingual learners, we're now at a point where we can move into design. And we can think about how we can use the information that we've gained in the discovery phase, how we can calibrate that to the needs of our local community, which might be different from the needs of our neighboring district, and create something that really is responsive and relevant to our students. So we start by crafting a series of belief statements through consensus, which everybody can get behind, that everybody believes to be true. And we use those belief statements to kind of ground our work in design. And then we move into generating hypotheses of practice, where we speak to what we think is the best instructional course to take. And remember, we're always looking back to what we discovered to inform our decisions in the design phase. With alignment, we're looking to see how our initial change or modernization is going to align with the district's strategic plan, with other initiatives that are out there or that are on the horizon that are likely to come down the pike eventually. Okay, so we want to try to avoid from the get-go, if we can, conflict. We want to create something that's harmonious and that works not just in the community at large, but also in the school community. What is going to work with all the things that either already exist within the community or are on the horizon for future implementation? A big part of design is to articulate responsibilities and to really spell out who is responsible for what is the principal's responsibility, what is the director's responsibility, what is the teacher's responsibility, what are ESL teachers' responsibilities, bilingual, dual, gen ed, etc. And really having a conversation and arriving at consensus as to how that should look so that there's no question, but we're eliminating through this practice the idea that these are my kids and those are your kids. And it's really advancing and promoting shared responsibility. Key to program design for multilingual learners is also the idea of instructional emphasis and language allocation. So probably the two most familiar instructional frameworks that are out there would be SIOP or GLAD. Those are two kind of overarching instructional frameworks that many districts in Illinois have adopted. And getting really clear, so thinking teacher clarity, right? Getting really clear about what our framework is and what our expectations are for daily instruction. And we can use formats that have been developed by others and researched, for example, SIOP or GLAD, but there are others out there as well that might be worth investigation. And then language allocation. This is especially important in bilingual and dual programs, making decisions about how you're going to use both languages in instruction and how you're going to allow for time for translanguaging and really baking that into the model. There's probably nothing more frustrating. Well, maybe some things are more frustrating, but it's very frustrating when teachers know that they need to be doing bilingual instruction, but the infrastructure that's been developed doesn't support the use of two languages. So we want to make sure, again, that everything is well aligned and very supportive of our intentions. And then at this stage, we take Tony Wagner's 4 C's, which I'll explain shortly, and we think aspirationally. Whereas the as-is map was the status quo, what's our current status. The to-be map is the aspirational. If we could design nirvana for our multilingual learners, what would it look like? And then we're going to obviously pare that down because nirvana doesn't exist, but we start at nirvana and then we think, what are our restraints? What are our budget limitations? What other constraints might be applicable? And then we start action planning. And most of you, I'm imagining, are fairly familiar with action planning. It's pretty much the same no matter what model you use, but just putting to paper kind of what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, who's going to do it, what's our time frame, what's our aspects of evidence or measurable objectives, what might be some hazards that we think we're going to encounter, and how will we know when we're successful. And then we move into the final stage, which is deliver. Next to final stage, which is deliver. And we've got a design, we've got our findings, we've got our recommendations, we've gone to the board, we've presented, we've received approval to go ahead. Now we want to make sure that we're putting aspects in place that will really result in transformative change. So we might put things through SWOT analysis to assess, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We may strategize to see how we can de-silo some of our departments, or we can have cross-department collaboration. We might think deliberately about how we're going to message and communicate the change out, certainly initially, but then how are we going to keep the momentum going during the time we need to fully implement the change? We want to think about continuous improvement. So are we on a 5-year cycle? One of the case lawsuits that's very important for educational programs for multilingual learners is Castaneda versus Picard, which demands that school districts periodically look at their programming and assess, is it working? And so most districts get on a 5-year cycle. That seems more manageable. And then periodically check to see, how is this new design meeting our objectives? What are the student outcomes? What is our program evaluation? And then we also want to think about resources. And certainly curriculum comes to mind, and assessments, but it's more than that. It's time, it's space, it's the allocation of monies. And think about, how are we allocating resources to best serve our bilingual students? And then finally, we move into support, which we want to make sure that we're planning for professional learning that needs to be offered in order to support this change, that we're thinking about innovative ways to support people. One of my bullets is chocolate talks. I used to do these quite frequently and just set up shop in the teacher's lounge and say, I'll be there all day, ask me anything. Oh, and I'm bringing all kinds of chocolate. And that was a really easy but effective way to increase conversation and make sure that everybody was hearing the same message, and that everybody was actually hearing the message, because sometimes they don't read the emails. Mutual meetings with principals. Going back to the talk about perspective, really, a bilingual director needs to be supporting the instructional leaders in the building, the principals. And so setting up times that are guarded on the calendar with co-constructed agendas, so anybody can add to the agenda. And then going to those meetings really to listen, to hear what support the principal needs in order to, lead this program in their building is key. And classroom pop-ins to kind of see how it's flowing, if it's working firsthand. And then don't forget regular board reports to let your board members know how successful this new change is for the students, for the parents, for the community, for the teachers and the principals. So that's a lot of information in a short amount of time. Before I go on, do you have any questions? Okay. So this is Tony Wagner's 4 C's. His as is and to be. And really, it's just talking about context, conditions, competencies, and culture. And put the definitions for you on the screen. Sometimes people forget about context and conditions. Competencies, I think, are always at the forefront of everyone's mind, and certainly culture, meaning like the climate in the building. But we have to take a look at the expectations and the skill demands that are coming at us from multiple directions, because that is where potential conflict lies. And we need to be sure we're assessing that in a good way, and then applying what we understand the context to currently be versus what we want to mold the context to be in the future. And the same for conditions. This, I think, is most often discussed by teachers, but even principals will say that the conditions are just not right or are not supportive for meeting goals and expectations. So we wanted to be sure that we're taking that into consideration and thinking about the infrastructure that we want to put in place to support the teachers and the principals and everybody else as they're doing their best to help the students learn. And then, of course, competencies, we may think of that as teacher competencies, but there's also administrator competencies to consider, secretarial competencies to consider. It runs the gamut. Some cross-pollination, making sure, for example, that special ed teachers are learning about ESL and bilingual for their kids with a dual diagnosis, and vice versa. The ESL bilingual dual teachers are learning about special ed for their kids that have a dual diagnosis. And then culture. Sometimes this can stay static despite changes in the student population or changes in the outer community. And we need to tune into that and make sure that the culture and the climate in which everybody is working is, again, supportive to meet our end goals. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to just jot down wherever you are and think, well, if I think about my program as is right now, what are some of the program variables that I think have the greatest impact in my community? And let's categorize them in terms of context, conditions, competencies, and culture. And just jot those down on paper. And then if you would, add them to the chat, but identify like which category the item is in. Let us know. Are you thinking of this as context or conditions, competencies, or culture? And think about how these variables, are impactful to your multilingual learners and why. I'm going to go ahead and reverse and go back to the original slide just so you can see the definitions of each of the 4 categories. So in the last district I worked at, we determined that we wanted a greater level of competency among our gen ed teachers to work with our multilingual students. And so that figured into our program design. It's because our population was increasing. I mean, we had 70% coming from a non-English language background and 33% were current ELs of our total population. And so that identifying that competency issue is what propelled us to create a 5-year plan to have every single teacher in our district have the ESL endorsement. So over a 5-year period, we went from 9 ESL teachers to over 100, which dramatically changed our student outcomes in like a really, really positive way. So thinking about these things can really, especially if you zero in, can really help you pinpoint aspects of the program design that are going to yield the greatest result for your efforts. So someone is mentioning in the comments the ELD standards. Just to say, they're not new. They've been state approved for almost 20 years. They were approved in 2004. But that might be an aspect of competency that you want to address, is like, do all teachers know about the ELD state standards, and to what extent are all teachers teaching to those standards? Or from an alternate perspective, to what extent is our curriculum incorporating the ELD standards? And are we making sure that when we purchase new curricula that it adheres to the ELD standards in addition to the other state content standards? So do you see how there's many ways to look at some of these issues and to think about how, oh yes, they were recently updated, yes. But do you see how there's many ways that you can look at these and really kind of get down to brass tacks? Yes, and so I'm seeing a comment about conditions, which, yeah, the conditions that were written in the chat are not conducive to great outcomes. And so how can those conditions be changed so that they're better supporting the outcomes that the district or the community or families want to see? So now you've spent some time thinking about your status quo, your current situation. Now I'd like you to think about your aspirational, or what would be fantastic if it could happen. And don't, at this point, don't put constraints on yourself. Don't think, oh, that can never happen here, but just think about what would be ideal, and jot those down in the chat. What things, context, condition, competencies, or culture would just like make a world of difference if you could implement in your situation?
And Nikki, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like me to enable your microphone? Is there something you wanted to share out verbally? You can type to me in chat.
So someone writes that changing conditions to ensure that multilingual learners receive services would increase competencies. And I think that's beautiful that you saw the interdependence between these categories, because when you improve on one, often others improve as well. So there is an interdependence or connectedness in this framework that Tony Wagner has suggested, and I use very frequently. I find it to be flexible enough that we capture everything we need to talk about, but it keeps our attention focused on the things that matter. Yes, and I'm seeing aspects in the chat about culture. This notion of shared responsibility is really powerful. And when you're able to kind of get more oars in the water rowing in the same direction, it really can turn everything around. When I went to my last district, I felt, looking at the number of current ELs, it was 33%, and essentially 9 teachers were responsible for comprehensible instruction for 33% of the student population. That just seemed unsustainable and unmanageable. And certainly the teachers were telling me that they were burning out, that this just was not anything they could continue doing. And so when I looked at the trends, our multilingual learner subgroup is the fastest growing subgroup of all possible subgroups in Illinois, but also nationwide. So addressing that issue through context, conditions, competencies, and culture was the way to go. But because we had gone through the discovery phase, everybody on the team also understood the urgency and the need for making that move. And so you're also mentioning newcomers. I heard Illinois just got 27 more buses of newcomers. In my career, this has happened before, but I realized for many other people, like, this is relatively new. We did experience this with the Vietnam War, with the conflict in El Salvador, with the conflict in Bosnia, but it is happening now, no denying that, and thinking about how do we meet these children's needs. Many of them they're what we call SLIFE students, students with limited or interrupted formal education, and is our continuum, our context and conditions and competencies well suited to meet those students' needs. So I'm going to move to the next slide. Hopefully this has been helpful, and urge you to use the handouts to make a quick action plan to initiate program modernization in your district. This is not to actually create the modernization right now, but to think about, well, what would I have to do in my district to, like, generate interest and generate participation, and how could I move my district to undertake this effort? How can I make them see why this is so important? I've given you 2 handouts that you can use to help you. The first is a logic model, and I give you one with kind of the definitions, and then there's a blank one that you can fill in with your own. But the idea of a logic model is to put a concept on one piece of paper that assists you in communicating and messaging out rather than, just reams and reams of narrative. This just helps people envision what you're advocating for. And so you see over on the left of the screen, you've got the current situation, and you would put like some statistics, some numbers, some percentages. That creates kind of a sense of urgency based on the facts. And then you might establish some priorities, and then you want to talk about inputs and outputs. Like if we invest on the input side, values and resources, and we create these outputs, activities and products, what are the outcomes we are likely to see, short-term and then long-term impact? And we're always aware of assumptions, underlying assumptions, and external factors that can play into this. But this is a nice way to kind of quickly communicate with just one page, whether it's to a board or to a superintendent or to your leadership team in one fell swoop, and to get the conversation going about the desire for improvement. So, and then this is just an action planning sheet with the goal of, okay, how would I go about pursuing program modernization, given what we've discussed today? So I'll leave you to do that for the next 10 minutes or so, or to go back and revisit Wagner's 4 C's as is and to be, or to ask me questions.
Anthony Rodriguez, you've got your hand up. Would you like me to allow you to unmute your microphone? If you've got a question you wanted to share out verbally. No, okay. Thank you.
And there's some great ideas in the chat here. People who are sharing the we to can do descriptors out way beyond the ESL and bilingual staff. That's a very powerful practice. Sometimes the solution may be, different resource allocation, moving things around. Doesn't necessarily always mean like new hires or new configurations. I think for those of you that are experiencing an influx and this is your first time dealing with multilingual learners, it can be very overwhelming. And so hopefully you would find some comfort in this process because it helps you stay focused and organized, and kind of keeps your eye on the end goal. For those who are in established programs, sometimes program designs were created from scratch 20, 30 years ago, and they made sense back then, either because of the research we had at the time or because of the numbers or the language groups or whatever. But then over time, it's increasingly apparent that it's just not working anymore. But sometimes there is reluctance to take on program change or program redesign because it can feel a bit overwhelming, and you have your other things to do, your managerial and leadership things as well. So again, I'm sharing with you this afternoon kind of what has worked for me over the years across 3 different school districts in Illinois, but also consulting nationally in different contexts. So I want to respond to Jen Baker's question. I'm not exactly sure what you mean about research sources. So I'd love to answer the question, but I don't know what you mean by research sources. So I'm going to address a question in the chat, so I think it has wide applicability. The situation that you're facing when you have low numbers of English learners. The research on English learners doesn't differentiate into whether you have high or low numbers. It just talks about what's needed, what multilingual learners need in their instruction. I think you get into the differentiation aspect of what's best practice in terms of compliance. But like what's reasonable to provide for one child is different than what is the expectation for 10 to 20 children, and then what's expected for, let's say, 100 children in a building. And that, I really don't know of any research. It's like conventional wisdom that you gain from being in the field of ESL and bilingual. But the thing I often say is, well, if we had one child who was blind, only one child, what would we do? And, you know, aside from an outplacement decision, like we would rally around that student. And so I think the same urgency or care and concern should be applied even when we have one multilingual learner who speaks no English. What that looks like in practice, that's another story. And I think that's where you can look at what the research says and see, okay, what do my local resources and community allow me to do so that I can get as close to the aspirational as possible. Obviously, you're not going to provide bilingual instruction for one student. And in Illinois, we're only compelled to do that when we hit 20 in a building, because that's the point where it's economically feasible. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but I know it's difficult, but sometimes to persuade folks, you have to find a way to get them to walk in other people's shoes for a moment, or juxtapose the situation against another, maybe more familiar situation, so that they can see the parallels, they can see the similarities. Yes, Jen. So she said she uses the analogy of a hard of hearing student. Yes. So I want to open it up for questions that anybody might have. Also, I realized this was a lot of information kind of coming at you fast at the end of a day, of a beautiful day. So these are the places you can reach me if you have questions later on, or you want some help in kind of securing some resources, some research, some data. I'm happy to help in that way. You can reach me via email or on my LinkedIn profile. So thank you so much for having me, especially on such a beautiful day. I want to send you all outside to enjoy the last of summer.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Barbara, for your time this afternoon, showing us the way to modernizing these ESL program designs. Great information. I hope everybody got the handouts that I emailed earlier this morning. I'm going to put a link to them in chat just to make sure you, again, walk away with everything that Dr. Marler intended you to. So here they come in chat. Oh, not that one. Here we go. And I want to thank you all for attending this Ed Leaders Network live webinar. I will be stopping the recording now.